So welcome again to the 4th annual lecture of the UCL Sociology Network. And I will introduce our two speakers and kind of lay out a plan for this evening. But I'll first introduce the UCL Sociology Network. We set up the network, myself and Caroline Oliver, in 2022. And we did that because we felt there are so many great scholars and lecturers and teachers across UCL doing sociological research, but we weren't connecting with one another, and in particular our PhD students were struggling to connect with one another. And in fact, when we suggested, we found out there had been a UCL Sociology Network before, so we were in fact revitalizing a pre-existing network. And our PhD group, I have to give a shout out to them. Today they had their inaugural PhD conference. Many of you, well, some of you anyway, some of your colleagues will have been there today chairing events and generally supporting our PhD students. It was a really fantastic event, just mind-blowing. Excellent papers and presentations and really well organized, of course facilitated by our stellar Michael Reed, who also organized us all today for this lecture. So if you are a UCL staff member, please consider joining the network. It doesn't entail absolutely anything except being on the email list and hearing about our events. We have the annual lecture, of course, but later on this year, we have, for example, an event on the uses of AI in qualitative data analysis. Next year, we'll have an event with the Department of Work and Pensions. We host book launches, thematic events, and so on and so forth. So to move on to this evening, our speaker today for the annual lecture is Dr. Musa al-Gharbi. And Musa is an assistant professor at Stony Brook University in the US. And amazingly, Musa finished his PhD just 2 years ago, but he's already made a significant impact, I think, in particular in the public sphere. So some of you, including myself, will have read some of his articles in newspapers such as The Guardian and various other outlets. So I can see, from my perspective, a very strong commitment to public engagement, thinking about communicating his ideas within the academe, but beyond the academe as well. So his work can be perceived as provocative, certainly at times, but it's also very timely, given the recent election results in the US. But we're particularly excited today to hear about his perspective on sociology as a discipline and how he sees the role of sociology in the particular research questions that he is puzzling. I use the word puzzling because you use the word puzzling as well. And then we will have a respondent or discussant, Professor Gargi Bhattacharya. Gargi is the director of the Sarah Parker Riemann Center here at UCL. Many of you will be familiar with their work and their writing, in particular on issues of inequality, social justice, and state practices. And we are delighted that they are responding to Musa's talk today. So Musa will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll hand over to Gargi, who will reflect on the talk and Musa's book, perhaps pose some questions to Musa, and then we'll open up for a brief audience Q&A. But the majority of the Q&A we're hoping will happen during the drinks reception. Important note, drinks reception is clearly not going to be in this room. And I don't know where the other room is, but Michael does. Michael is there. So we'll all have to follow Michael at the end. Let's not forget that. Past lectures, we've had people kind of lingering, chatting, and then we lose them. So no lingering and chatting. Walk and talk. Follow Michael as soon as he moves. One final thing, the lecture is being recorded today, so no need to record it yourselves. In fact, we'd rather you didn't, so that nobody's caught on camera that doesn't want to be. And you'll be able to, if you should wish to, watch the lecture afterwards on the UCL YouTube. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Musa.
So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my book and help situate my book in the discipline of sociology, to kind of talk about what I perceived anyway, some of its core sociological contributions and to be. I'll start by kind of setting the stage a little bit. So the book is about this group of people who I call symbolic capitalists. Symbolic capitalists are people who work in professions where they're manipulating symbols and idea, rhetoric, data, and so forth. So you can think as a shorthand, people who work in fields like media, consulting, finance, academia, and so on. They're people who don't produce physical goods and services to people. If you're in this room, there's a good chance that you're either a symbolic capitalist already, or you're aspiring to be one, hence Lord Kitchener pointing out, and I am also a symbolic capitalist, so he is pointing at me as well. In fact, he's pointing at me in lots of screens here. So the we and we have never been woke is this new elite constellation, people who manipulate symbols and data and ideas and so on. One of the many interesting things about symbolic capitalists is that from the beginning of our professions, we have this kind of deep and interesting relationship with social justice narratives. So at the origin of a lot of our professions, like symbolic capitalists compared to most other workers, we have a lot more pay than most other people, a lot more autonomy, a lot more prestige. And as our professions were organizing in their kind of recognizably modern form, the case that we made for why we deserve this prestige, this autonomy, and so on, was because if you shouldn't give us these things for our own sake, but because if you give us this autonomy and this prestige and this compensation and so on, it will better empower us to help everyone in society, including and especially the least among us. A lot of our professions are explicitly defined in terms of altruism and serving the common good. So to use my own professions, journalists are supposed to speak truth to power and to be a voice for the voiceless. And academics are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads and to tell the truth without regards to anyone else's political or economic interests. If you look at the contemporary landscape today, in the United States and actually most other Western European countries, at who in society is most likely to self-identify as an environmentalist, as an anti-racist, as a feminist, as an ally to LGBTQ people, and so on, it's symbolic capitalists. Ideologically, symbolic capitalists overwhelmingly identify as progressive or liberal or leftist or some other adjacent term that indicates left of center. And politically, we vote overwhelmingly and increasingly for left of center parties as well. And so this is interesting because starting in the interwar period and then accelerating after the 60s, there were these big changes to the global economy that radically increased the amount of influence that symbolic capitalists have over society. And one might think, given how we understand ourselves, given how our professions are defined, what you might expect is that as people like us grew in affluence and influence, you'd expect to see inequality shrinking. You'd expect to see long-standing social problems getting ameliorated. You'd expect to see growing trust in institutions because of all the great work that we're doing, you know? That's not what we've seen. Over the last 50 years, we've seen growing inequalities, increasing institutional mistrust and dysfunction, growing affective polarization. A lot of long-standing social problems have not only persisted, but in some cases, grown worse. And so the core puzzle that the book is trying to wrestle with is basically, what's going on here? Why do we live in the world we actually live in, rather than the world we might have hoped or expected, the world that previous cohorts of symbolic capitalists promised, that if you give us more power, if you give us more influence, you know, this is the world we'll live in. We're not living in that world. The book is trying to figure out why not. The book is itself a participant in a genre that was started in the field of sociology, was for a while somewhat prominent in the field of sociology, and then kind of disappeared for a while. Or in any case, the conversation has largely moved outside of the field of sociology for a whole bunch of interesting reasons. So, you know, Marx was probably the first one to really conceptualize this class and start talking about its relationship to politics and economics. Starting in Capital, Volume 3, he described the group of people that I call symbolic capitalists. He described them as functioning capitalists. And there are a whole bunch of other important scholars in the field of sociology who referred to them by other names and conceptualized them in slightly different ways. They've also been called the new class, the creative class, class X, a lot of classy terms. There's a reason why I didn't refer to them as a class. It would be kind of a digression to go into right now. But for people who are interested in that question and who are interested in learning more about how other scholars have conceptualized this elite formation, I have an article on my Substack where I kind of walk through this. I couldn't provide a literature review in the book. Princeton University Press was very insistent that this is a book it's a crossover text that's not just for nerds and sociologists in particular. It's supposed to be for a wider range of people. So there's no lit review in the book. But if you're interested in that, I put it up on the Substack here. Now the migration of the conversation around this elite formation, largely outside of the field of sociology, to my mind, was unfortunate because I believe that the discipline of sociology provides us with a lot of conceptual and methodological tools that can shed a different kind of light on the role that symbolic capitalists play in society and the role and the kind of the causes and consequences of how we relate to other people that other disciplines just can't. One of the big goals of the book was to discipline a lot of conversations about culture. So starting after 2010, there was this kind of big shift in how a non-trivial share of society started talking and thinking about social problems, a shift in their political orientations, a shift in activism, and a lot of the conversation to try to explain those shifts was rooted in vibes and anecdotes in a way that I found deeply unsatisfying. So something would happen on some college somewhere and then cue the histrionic claims like about kids these days and the internet and so on, like really kind of big claims being made on just like small incidents. And in a way that kind of begged the question. So they were insisting that something big was changing. But they didn't actually try to systematically observe that for the most part. Now, if there had actually been some big change in culture that was underway, this is a thing that we should be able to measure. So my colleagues and I set about trying to measure it. And we did, in fact, find that there were shifts. So for instance, this is from a paper that a colleague and I did where we analyzed 27 million news articles from 47 media outlets over the past 50 years. What we found is that starting after 2010, there was this radical shift in discussion about prejudice and discrimination in news media. All forms of prejudice and discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, misogyny, just poof, all at once. In a way that didn't seem to correspond with anything specifically happening in the world in that year with respect to race or gender or sociology, or sexuality. And statistical tests that we did seemed to suggest that there was one deeper shift that seemed to explain the vast majority of the variance over these periods, which is to say, most likely it seemed that something changed in the people who produced the news. There was a deeper underlying shift in the people who produced the news that generated these patterns. And the same kind of thing, where you can just clearly see this kind of shift happening, as I explored in other academic papers and public-facing papers, you can see the same kinds of shifts in academic research articles, in pop culture outputs like video games and television and movies. You can see the same kinds of shifts in in protest activity, you can see the same kinds of shifts in public opinion, but within a very small subset of public opinion. In particular, highly educated, relatively affluent urban and suburban people, especially whites, people who work in the knowledge professions basically, shifted, while the rest of society stayed pretty much on the same trajectory. You can see this, for instance, in some of the political graphs. So polarization widened dramatically after 2010. This is something that symbolic capitalists have noticed. Our story for why we are so far away from the rest of society is we're just assuming everyone else grew more radical. We're on the same trajectory. Everyone else is losing their minds. They're becoming racist and sexist and so on. What's interesting is that if you look at public opinion polls, that's not what you actually see in the data. So for instance, this is visualizing the American parties, so the color scheme is, I think, backwards from how it is here in the UK. So the Democrats, the Liberal Party, is the blue line here. The Conservatives are the red line. What you can see is that after starting in 2011, there was this kind of radical shift in how people on the blue line responded to poll and survey questions related to things like race, gender, sexuality, and so on, in a way that put them increasingly out of step with the median voter. Conservatives and Republicans during this same period didn't change much at all. And likewise, when you look at the party platforms of the Democratic and the Republican parties, you can see that the Democratic and Republican parties were pretty close in 2008. By 2016, they were very far apart. Why is that? Well, it's because of shifts on the Democrat line. The Republicans shifted a little bit to the right in 2012 before moderating under Donald Trump, and their position at the time that Trump was elected in 2016 wasn't very far at all from their position in 2008. The reason the gap was unprecedentedly large between the two parties was because of shifts on the blue line. The Democratic Party platform shifted radically between 2008 and 2012, and then even as Republicans moderated, Democrats continued on the same trajectory, which is the cause of the polarization. So you can see this shift in how people associated with the knowledge professions answer polls and surveys, how their preferred political party designs their platforms, the kind of candidates they field, the kind of messaging they relied on. You can see these changes in protest activity and so on. One of the great things about measuring things and taking a more systematic and disciplined approach was, one, you could see that the shift wasn't a general social shift. Again, it was confined to a very specific subset of stakeholders and institutions and communities. Two, you could see that the shifts that we saw after 2011 were actually a case of something. They weren't unprecedented. In fact, you can even see this, just eyeballing it, in this is why I like this image, in this graph from the paper that I did with my colleagues. So for instance, you can see for certain words, like transphobia wasn't a topic of discussion in the 1970s in the same way. Islamophobia wasn't really a topic of discussion until after 9/11. But for words that have been in circulation for a while, you can see that in the late 80s, early 90s, there was this spike in talk about racism, homophobia, sexism, anti-Semitism, just boop, 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 all at once, in a very similar way that we see today. This got me curious. So one of the things I found over the course of my research is that looking at the same kinds of empirical indicators, we can see that this period of shifting that we saw after 2010 was actually a case of something. And there were three previous awakenings in the 20th century, in addition to the one we're currently exiting in the 21st. And by comparing and contrasting these cases, we can get leverage on questions like, well, why do these periods of awakening happen? Why do they happen when they do? What, if anything, do they tend to change? What is their legacy? Why do they end? Why don't they just go on forever? And so these are questions that I take up in chapter 2 of the book. I tried to, I was urged by Princeton not to throw in tons and tons of graphs and charts, and certainly not like tons and tons of multicolored graphs and charts, because that's expensive and awkward to format and all of that. But if you want to see a bunch of graphs and charts, on my website here, if you go to this, I have an essay called The Great Awakening is Winding Down that shows that this period of change we saw after 2010, there was another change after around 2021. It includes a lot of graphs and charts like this. So if you want the graphs and charts, they're available. In terms of situating the arguments and findings of the book in the field of sociology, broadly, the book owes a great debt to Pierre Bourdieu. It's not kind of a hardcore Bourdieusian analysis, like in the sense that I don't like to chain myself to one particular theorist over much. But the book does draw heavily from Bourdieu, engages significantly with some of his work, and builds upon it in important ways. So for instance, the central focus of the book, symbolic capitalists. Symbolic capital is a term that I took from Bourdieu. Symbolic capital in Bourdieu's work referred to the resources that elites draw on to get other people to defer to them to do what they want to do without having to rely on stark coercion. As Weber and others pointed out, the only way a lot of social orders, inequalities, things like this, the only way they actually function is with the consent of the people being dominated. If you have to rely on stark coercion all the time, that's very expensive. It's actually very difficult to do. So you need buy-in from the people you're dominating. Bourdieu came up with different ways to kind of analyze these different cultural resources and other resources that elites draw on to make inequality seem normal and appropriate to get other people to do what they want. He called those resources, he used symbolic capital as a way of describing those resources. I refer to the elite constellation at the center of this book as symbolic capitalists because we primarily make a living based on what we know, who we know, and how we're known. That is by cultivating and leveraging symbolic capital on behalf of ourselves and other people. In Homo Academicus, Bourdieu analyzed how he was looking at the student protest movements on campus in the 1960s, and not just student protests, but also faculty, perhaps actually especially faculty, was looking at how academics during the 1960s basically were making strong claims about social justice and trying to accomplish all of these good social ends, but in practice, they were using this activism and these claims about social justice in ways to enhance themselves, advance their own position, further their own goals. Homo Academicus is a kind of is an exploration of this happening in one concrete case in academia in France in the 1960s. The book, my book, better, We Have Never Been Woke, expands Bourdieu's analysis to a wider range of cases. At the time Bourdieu was writing, there had only been one previous Great Awakening, so he couldn't have, so it would have been difficult for him to conceptualize and compare and contrast them in quite the same way. I also zoom out beyond just looking at academia to look at the whole sector of professions, the system of professions that are involved in symbolic, in the symbolic sphere, and I can make use of a bunch of different methodological tools that were just not available to Bourdieu at the time that he was writing. But it is very, but the deep argument of the book is very much derived from Homo Academicus in an important sense. And then finally, Bourdieu's book on Manet explores symbolic revolutions, these periods of kind of rapid change and how people, in kind of discourse and so on. My analysis of why these symbolic revolutions happen rhymes with his. It's not the same as his. I'm much more influenced by sociologists Jack Goldstone and Peter Turchin's work. But again, Bourdieu is a very big influence of mine. Weber was another big influence. He was a big influence on Bourdieu, but he was a big influence on me, and as well, separately and independently of that, in a number of ways. First, Weber is very helpful for thinking about the relationship between interest and ideology. Oftentimes, when people talk about interests, the first thing they think is material interest. So when I say that academics and journalists and consultants leverage social justice discourse in the pursuit of their interests, maybe the first thing that comes to mind is financial interests. They're trying to make that money. Oh man, that's a Trump dance. That wasn't great. Anyway, they're trying to make money and things like this. That's one way of conceptualizing interest. It's an important way of conceptualizing interest. But it's not, we have interests beyond our material concerns. This is something that Weber did a very good job of stressing. He emphasized that in addition, for instance, to material interests like food, security, things like this, we also have ideal interests. We want to love and love others and be loved in turn. We want to have a decent social standing. We want to build a legacy that survives us after we're dead. Things like this. These are examples of ideal interests. Weber very effectively showed that ideal interests are often more important to us than our material interests. People often sacrifice their material interests in pursuit of ideal interests. And so this kind of crass materialism that people often kind of rely on when they discuss interests is just not helpful, and Weber is a very good resource for understanding why. Another important thing that I drew from Weber is that while it's definitely true that ideologies are often reflections of one's social standing, and they can be used in the service of one's interests, they aren't just that. They aren't just tools. Ideas can, as he showed in his book on the Protestant Reformation and in other work, ideas can shape how people conceptualize their interests, how they pursue their interests. They exert often their own independent force, which is often very different. Like the social life of ideas is often very different from what the progenitors of those ideas might have wanted or expected, what the people mobilizing those ideas might have wanted or expected. And so We Have Never Been Woke looks at how a set of ideas that were derived in a deep sense from the social gospel movements and transformed over time in interaction with different, came to define a set of professions, giving rise to unique forms of status competition, power competition, and so on within those professions. Another way in which Weber is useful and helpful, especially his kind of rejection of crass materialism, is that often in the discourse, there's this kind of move people make where if you show that someone has an interest in believing something, that someone has an interest in advancing a set of ideas, you go, ha ha ha, you have an interest in advancing this, therefore you must be cynical, you've been exposed. This kind of move is actually not a very good way of thinking about thinking. There's actually a lot of research in the cognitive and behavioral sciences that I go over in this Substack article for people who are curious, that shows at a very fundamental level the ways that we perceive the world, the ways we think about the world, the stories that we tell about why things are the way they are, why they aren't the way they aren't, attributions. All of these things. We don't, for instance, right now, in this room, in this moment, I'm being confronted with just tons and tons of data. I could count how many people are in the audience, how many people have black hair, how many people have orange shirts, how many lights are on the roof, and so on. I'm just bombarded with data. I can't possibly attend to it all. I can't possibly remember it all, and it wouldn't be valuable if I could. So I have to make these choices about what to remember, about what to focus on, about how to fit the different things that I'm paying attention to into a coherent picture. I don't make these, my brain doesn't make these decisions in a random way or a disinterested way. My brain makes these decisions in ways that advance my interests and further my goals. And this is usually a fitness-enhancing tendency. If we take this literature seriously, we can see that there's not actually a contradiction between having an interest in believing something and believing that thing sincerely. In fact, if we had an interest in believing something, we'd be especially likely to believe it sincerely, passionately, to try to get other people to believe that thing too. And so the argument of my book isn't that symbolic capitalists are cynical or insincere when we say things like, we want the people at the margins of society to live lives of dignity and inclusion. We're not lying. When we say we want the poor and the disadvantaged to be able to rise up and have a more comfortable, stable lives, that's not a deception. When people were crying after George Floyd was murdered, that was a performance, but it wasn't just a performance. They were sad. The problem isn't that symbolic capitalists don't believe hard enough in social justice. The problem, or a lot of the tensions that have defined this profession arise from the fact that while we are sincerely committed to these social justice goals, this isn't our only set of sincere commitments. We're also sincerely committed to being elites, which is to say, we think that our perspectives and priorities should count more than the people checking us out. I was going to say at Stop and Shop, but I'm trying to remember what's the UK equivalent of this, at the grocery store. We think that we should have a higher standard of living than the people delivering our packages to our doors every day. We want our children to reproduce our own social position or to do even better than us. This set of commitments is also very sincere. And it lies in tension with some of the other commitments that we have, right? You can't actually be an egalitarian social climber. It's a contradiction in terms. And so what the book argues is that when these two sets of sincere commitments come into conflict, as they often do, it's our desire to be an elite that often ends up winning out, pressuring us, cognitively, to try to pursue these social justice goals, primarily in ways that don't cost us anything, risk anything for us, require us to change anything about our own lifestyles, our own aspirations, and the aspirations we have for our children and so on. So this is all a line of thinking and inquiry that was, in a deep sense, inspired by Max Weber. Finally, Bruno Latour played a big influence in the work, in particular through his emphasis on reflexivity and analytical symmetry. So reflexivity is the idea that the stories that we tell about society in general should also apply to us, to our families, to our communities, to the institutions that we belong to and we like. So if we tell stories about how people are driven by these base motivations, how people are this way or that way, we are also people. And so those things are also true of us. Our spouses are people. Those things are true of our spouses. Our children are people. Those things are true of our children. And so any story that we tell about society as a whole or people as a whole, we should be able to fold ourselves into that picture, fold the institutions that we belong to into that picture, and so on. Analytical symmetry is the idea that you should analyze the same kinds of behaviors or relationships or states of affairs in the same way, regardless of whether or not we personally identify with the group being analyzed or not. So this is something that on its face seems like it should definitely be done, but is actually a pretty radical commitment, and it's almost never done. So for instance, in the field of sociology, and actually in most social science fields, and most journalistic stuff for that matter, the same kinds of behaviors and practices are analyzed and discussed in systematically different ways, depending on who's doing it. So the tendency, for instance, for people to sort with people like themselves and to treat people who are more similar to themselves in preferential ways, this seems to be something like a human universal. But it's often not analyzed that way. When, say, African Americans or women prefer to work with other women, or to hire and promote other women, or to hire and promote other African Americans, and so on, this set of behaviors is usually analyzed through the lens of social solidarity, mobilizing social capital. These behaviors are praised. when people like whites or men engage in the exact same tendencies, preferring to hire and promote other men, preferring to work with other men, treating whites better than they treat non-whites, and so on, this exact same set of behavioral tendencies is analyzed through a completely different set of analytical tools, through white supremacy, the patriarchy, and so on, and these exact same behaviors that are praised for one group are villainized in another. What analytical symmetry would push us to do is to study the behavioral tendencies of all of these groups in the same way, to evaluate them the same way, using the same kinds of repertoires. This is what one of the things that Bruno Latour stressed in his essay, Why Is Critique Run Out of Steam? Reflexivity and symmetry, for that matter, were also big point, was like the point of his book, We Have Never Been Modern, from which my own book is a play on the title of his book. Yeah, and so the way that analytical symmetry and reflexivity express themselves in this book is that when I analyze elites, I don't exclude queer elites from analysis. I don't exclude black elites from analysis. I don't analyze black elites or queer elites or female elites any different than I analyze cisgender heterosexual white elites. They're engaging in the same behaviors, part of the same institutions, living the same kinds of lifestyles, then they're analyzed in the same way. Likewise, I also make it a point to analyze, although most symbolic capitalists are on the left, there is a right wing in the symbolic capitalists. There are conservative symbolic capitalists, there are anti-woke symbolic capitalists. Analytical symmetry obligates scholars to fold those people into the picture and analyze them in the same way. One of the things I stress throughout the book is that anti-woke and conservative symbolic capitalists approach politics in the exact same way. For the most part, it's the people they criticize. They're driven by the same mix of motives. They tend to live in the same communities, have the same kinds of lifestyles, take part in very similar institutions. And so pretty much everything I have to say about mainstream symbolic capitalists holds just as true. For anti-woke and conservative symbolic capitalists, I'll give one quick example, and I'll move on. In a lot of kind of right-leaning and anti-woke spaces, you'll hear things like, Ibram X. Kendi, boo. I support the Martin Luther King Jr. approach to anti-racism. And it's like, okay, cool. Well, are you organizing or participating in Martin Luther King-style social movements to address, say, poverty or resist war or deal with the remaining racialized inequalities in society? And the answer to that question is, of course, always no. They're sitting in their armchair criticizing the wokes and using that as a stand-in for taking substantive action in the world, which is to say they're not doing anything any different than the people they're criticizing. This is a kind of thing that you can see when you apply analytical symmetry. It's a thing that has led the book to go down kind of awkwardly in the culture wars. It puts the book at a kind of orthogonal angle to the culture wars. In the interest of symmetry, I'll just announce my next book. So when I initially wrote We Have Never Been Woke, the plan was to spend about half the book looking at symbolic capitalists and the institutions that we're part of and the communities that we're embedded in. And then towards the back half of the book, I was going to turn the analytical lens the other way, from the winners in the knowledge economy towards the people who perceive themselves to be the losers. I wrote the book as I initially intended, and I gave it to Princeton University Press, and it was way too long. So what we did is we cut the book in half. The original manuscript in half. The first half was kind of adjusted to stand on its own as a freestanding work, and that was published as We Have Never Been Woke. The second half is now in the process of being adjusted to stand as a freestanding work as well, and that's going to be published as Those People. It's now officially under contract with Princeton University Press. And so if We Have Never Been Woke, if the purpose of the first book was to look at the political economy of the symbolic professions from the interwar period through the present, Those People will explore the causes and the consequences of the growing social distance between symbolic capitalists and many other constituents in society. And with that, I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time. You can email me at musa@gmail.com. My website is just musa@gharbi.com, which has that email plus my socials. And you can follow me on the Substack. The Symbolic Capitalism is the name of my Substack. Thank you for your time.